Xyn seethed as he stared down Nick. He yelled something passionately into Nick's face, but Nick couldn't understand his language. The Void Mother dropped to all fours and started to retch. He vomited a dark fog onto the sand that quickly spread through the air, making it difficult to see like the ink from a squid. Nick braced himself, black blood pumping. He knew what was coming. It didn't take a second for Xyn to emerge from the fog. He swung a claw into Nick's guard, snapping his humerus instantly and cracking a couple ribs. It didn't feel like an attack from a humanoid. The force generated felt like getting hit by a truck. Nick had the wind knocked out of him and he flew through the air, finally coming to rest several meters away, gasping on the sand. No sooner had Nick regained his breath and sat up that Xyn was standing over him once more. He held the digits of his claw together to form a spear and coiled his arm back to strike. Nick knew he wouldn't be able to move fast enough to evade it. Instinctually, he roared, and the hot wind escaping his lips could be seen pushing Xyn back. For a moment, Xyn looked surprised. Nick wondered if the alien realized he was a Void Mother as well. Xyn's gills flapped as he drew in air, and then roared himself. Nick collapsed back down. He was being smothered into the sand. It was difficult to breathe, the air was moving so fast. Xyn was on another level, his control over the void masterful. Even if Nick had a millennium to train, it would not even compare to Xyn's experience. Nick could feel that he was suffocating. His brain wasn't getting enough oxygen and he was feeling sleepy. He was barely clinging to consciousness as Xyn's roar finally stopped. Xyn compressed his claw into a spear once more, and out of the fog, a spinstress emerged. It stood 2 feet taller than Xyn and swung its claw toward his head. Xyn could not avoid it in time, and the large knives at the end of the spinstress's fingers clipped his ear, tearing it off. Xyn leapt away, clutching the side of his head. 2 more spinstresses emerged from the fog and stood around Nick as if to protect him. Xyn lurched onto all fours and vomited up more of the ink-like fog. The 3 spinstresses did not seem to be bothered by it, lumbering silently into the cloud. From the darkness, the sound of clashing claws emerged, accompanied by sparks, visible as flashes of light, illuminating patches of haze. With his good arm, Nick began pulling himself back, away from the battlefield. He could hear Xyn breathing heavily, fighting hard. The spinstresses were terrifying, and he was glad they were on his side. They made very little noise as they moved, and seemed almost robotic, or like puppets. Nick saw a large boulder behind him that he made his way over to, and propped himself up against it. He was still finding it exceedingly hard to breathe, and wondered if one of his broken ribs had punctured his lung. "Nick, is that you?" A worried voice called through the edge of the fog. James appeared, looking determined. "We've got to get you onto the ship. It's not safe out here." "Thank you," Nick said sincerely, as he looped his good arm around James's shoulders and shuffled away. They walked along the outskirts of the fog, able to hear where the battle was taking place and avoid it. "We'll be able to better see what's going on the ship's landing radar. That's how I found you," James mentioned. The air was heating up, the wind singeing their skin. Xyn was exerting more energy, fighting harder, as more spinstresses joined the fray from the ruins. They made it into the ship's airlock just as the heat was becoming unbearable, and as the interior door opened, the familiar smell of the cabin broke across Nick's nose. It had only been a couple days, but Nick was realizing just how much he'd missed the ship. "Let's get you into the med bay," James assumed, but Nick withdrew his arm from around James's shoulders. "Not yet. I need to see what happens," he wheezed. James stood in place for a moment, then followed Nick to the dash. "Well, there's still lots of battery life," he muttered. On the landing radar, Nick could now see that there was something like 25 Spinstresses attacking Xyn in unison, and they were using their numbers to their strategic advantage, moving defensively, attacking only from his blind spot like wolves. The dark fog had cleared and Xyn was unable to produce more, having not had an opportunity. It didn't seem to be helping him anyways. The Spinstresses didn't seem to need to see, and at the front window they could now be seen plainly. Xyn was leaping into the air and striking the ground. Explosive shockwaves in the sand sent the Spinstresses flying, but it was a losing battle. He was tiring. One Spinstress closed on him quickly after a ground strike, and with its mighty claw punctured his chest through his back. Two more moved on him, clawing through his gut and leg. He was pinned, unable to move, breathing heavily. But for some reason, the other Spinstresses weren't finishing the job. They were just standing around in a circle, watching. Nick's heart beat a little faster, worried they would give up the advantage they'd won. Something massive appeared in the sky, an impossibly large tendril covered in fire. It was one of the arms of Ubyx. For a creature of his size, the arm came to a very fine point. The two humans in the spaceship sat in awe, as it seemed now James was able to see it as well. Nick blinked, and they were in space. Ubyx must have teleported them. Was this it? Was he going to destroy the planet? Through the satellite camera at the bottom of the ship, Nick and James watched as the Spinstresses continued to hold firm, giving their lives to ensure the death of the Void Mother of Ubyx Grata. The arm of the Weaver plunged into the desert, directly on top of the creatures. Fire and cloud raged through the 1,000-kilometer radius impact site. Nothing could have survived that, James said confidently. The ocean of Placea under the planet's crust came bubbling up to the surface, erupting into a spectacular volcanic display that almost reached the ship in space. Ubyx withdrew his arm. His enormous stoic face rested in the void between their ship and the white dwarf. From orbit, his face appeared hundreds of times larger than the star, and his long body could not be seen as it slinked away into the darkness, possibly ending in a different solar system. "I can't believe something like this exists," James uttered, freshly horrified. Nick said nothing, again wondering when James had drank Placea. There was a commotion on the surface of the desert world, and through the camera they saw that the Void Mother still lived. He was levitating above the storms of Placea, enshrouded in an odd dark. Black lightning struck the planet around him, pulverizing the oceans with blasts of air. Xyn tilted his head back and opened his eyes and mouth. A dark light shone through them, beaming up like a spotlight into the void. It looked eerily similar to the way the Spinstresses had summoned the Weaver. Nothing needed to be said. Everyone knew what was coming. The signal sustained for 5 seconds before Xyn's body quickly disintegrated, having used the last of his power to summon his master. A deep and abiding stillness took hold of space. The Weaver turned its head to look beyond the white dwarf, and Nick could feel a pull coming from that direction. A strange, thin shadow was passing over the star, and at first Nick wondered if it was a signal from the creatures living in the asteroids to the Weaver. James's horrified breathing sounded from beside him, and Nick widened his perspective. The shadow over the star was one thin, long tooth, and absolutely dominating their field of view was the face of the anglerfish. Its narrow pupils and bug eyes spanned their entire front window, and its chasmous mouth of long teeth stretched to the bottom of their window, despite being hundreds of millions of kilometers away. But even knowing that his Void Mother had died, the look on Ubyx Grata's face was one of glee. They were accelerating towards it. Its gravitational pull was that enormous. Ubyx Grata wriggled excitedly towards Ubyx, swallowing an entire star without even seeming to notice it. The weaver latched onto the serpent's face, and in the next instant they were gone. The ship maintained its momentum, but was no longer accelerating in any direction. Did they teleport? James asked. Somehow, Nick knew that they hadn't. Nick had inhaled Ubyx Grata's eggs previously, and now, after having seen him, he could feel his presence. He had turned sharply and was dragging the weaver with him faster than light into deep space. Nick closed his eyes and felt that he could see it. He could see the stoic face of Idjurnus as though he were viewing it through Ubyx Grata's eyes. The swarm was coming. He could feel it. Thousands of weavers on the march, pouring out into the space between galaxies, all acutely aware that the creature of Boot's Void was vulnerable. Weavers surrounded the serpent, vibrating like bees around a wasp. Massive swaths of Ubyx Grata's tail struck the weavers, killing some. Their massive bodies dissolved into the void, but they were persistent, wrapping their tendrils around the serpent, pouring into the battlefield from even more distant galaxies. Ubyx Grata was overheating, his body already several times hotter than a star. He bit at the space before him, trying to take Idjurnus with him, but the weaver endured, continuing to hold himself away from its maw. The winnower stopped moving, and finally it drifted slowly through space, dead.